Good evening, everyone. I'm Maureen Reidy, the President and CEO of the Paley Center for Media. And it is my great honor and pleasure to welcome you all to a very important and timely discussion this evening about the role of media and education in combating anti-Semitism. This event commemorates International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is tomorrow, January 27th, and is part of our ongoing effort to examine media's powerful shaping influence and unique ability to raise awareness around the growing crisis of anti-Semitism. Nearly 80 years have passed since the end of the Holocaust, and yet anti-Semitism is still a visible and increasingly dangerous reality in our society. And at this critical time, we still see a lack of understanding, awareness, and even an acknowledgement of the horrors of the Holocaust, especially amongst our young people. This conversation and all of our events in this PaleyImpact series on the role of media to combat anti-Semitism seek to shine a light on how media, in all its forms, can educate, inform, and make an impact on this vitally important issue. All programs in this series are made possible by Shari, Redstone, and Aryeh and Elana Bourkoff, whom we thank for their most generous support. Never before has Paley's mission been more vital, as media has been the undisputed connector during these unprecedented times. And Paley is uniquely positioned to meet this moment with impactful conversations led by influential figures. On this solemn occasion, we are honored to bring together several leading voices from education, politics, media, and entertainment to discuss the roles they have had and that they continue to play to battle anti-Semitism in our society. Our distinguished group of panelists include Holocaust survivor Mark Schonwetter, who is also the co-founder of the Mark Schonwetter Education Foundation. Former New York State Senator Anna Kaplan, who sponsored the Holocaust Education Bill in the state Senate, which was then signed into law by Governor Hochul in 2022. And Holocaust scholar and author Jennifer Lemberg, who currently serves as the Associate Director of U.S. Programs for the Olga Lengyel Institute for Holocaust Studies and Human Rights. On this meaningful occasion, I am pleased to introduce you to our moderator for tonight's discussion, Josh Tyrangiel. Josh is a 12-time Emmy and Peabody Award-winning journalist and filmmaker with an impressive resume with distinguished backgrounds, including executive roles at Time Magazine, Bloomberg Media, and he now owns his own production company. I ask you all to please join me in welcoming Josh. Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen. This is a very generous introduction. I would also only add that I am the grandson and son of Holocaust survivors. My father, blessedly, is still with us. And my great uncle is a man named Judah Nadich, who was Eisenhower's advisor on Jewish affairs and was one of the first people in the camps after their liberation, all of which is to say this is a very meaningful night for me, a very personal night. I'm grateful to be here. I'm very grateful my daughter is here. And I'm very grateful you guys are here. So let me introduce our panelists. Anna Kaplan is in her second term as a New York State Senator from the 7th District in Long Island. She was born Anna Monahemi to a Jewish family in Tabriz, Iran. And when the Islamic Revolution swept Iran, her parents made the agonizing decision to send her to the United States on her own. She learned English, which I believe is her fourth language, while living with a foster family in Chicago. And when the Monahemis were reunited, finally, in Queens, she graduated from Yeshiva University and then the Cardozo School of Law. Anna has been outspoken in her role as an elected official about the need for anti-bias education and tougher hate crime laws. And as you just saw, the Holocaust Education Bill became a law on August 10th, 2022. Please welcome Anna Kaplan. Jennifer Lemberg is Associate Director of U.S. Programs at the Olga Lengyel Institute for Holocaust Studies and Human Rights. In addition to her work there, she's taught interdisciplinary seminars. She's taught about American women in literature, American Indian literature. She published essays on the Holocaust, on Jewish American literature, on a lot of things. She's prolific. She co-edited a book called Becoming a Holocaust Educator, which was published in 2021. Please welcome Jennifer Lemberg. So when Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Mark Schoenwater was a 5-year-old boy living on his parents' farm in Poland. His father, Israel, was the leader of the Jewish community there, and one night in the spring of 1942, Israel was taken by the Gestapo. Knowing that they would be next, Mark, his mother, and his younger sister walked 15 miles in the middle of the night to a ghetto where they were very briefly safer, but only briefly. And they then spent the next 3 years hiding, often hidden by righteous and generous Poles. They then faked their identities and lived as refugees during the last several months of the war until they were liberated by the Russian army in February 1945. After the war, Mark and his immediate family eventually emigrated to Israel, and a few years later, Mark was sponsored to come to the United States, where he arrived, not with the proverbial $5 in his pocket, but actually with $5 in his pocket. He retired as the owner of his own wedding ring and bridal company. He's also the founder of the Mark Schoenwater Holocaust Education Foundation. Please welcome Mark Schoenwater. So thank you all for being here. It's a distinguished panel. Mark, how long have you been talking in schools, and how many kids have you spoken to, do you think?
Well, I start talking about it more aggressively, say, after I retired. However, when I got married and I had 2 kids, 2 daughters, so soon as they could understand, I start talking to them and explaining to them and give them the information how I survived the Holocaust. And then, after they grew up, they had their own kids, and they went, in the beginning, when they were going to Hebrew school, and the question was asked if they know any Holocaust survivors, and their lessons were about Holocaust. They mentioned that they have a grandfather who is a Holocaust survivor. So they asked him, can you ask him so he can come in and tell us about his survival? So, of course, they asked me, and I agreed. So there was, I would say, a start for me to talk about it. However, after I retired, I devoted my full time to go and to speak, mainly to the beginning, to high school kids, middle school kids, and also later on I start talking to organizations. And I felt very strong that when I started speaking to the kids, I noticed that many kids didn't know much at all about the Holocaust. When it came to questions and answers, the questions were, if they were few, very simple and knowledgeable what's going on. So more I went, more I saw that something has to be done for the new generation, for the future generation. And this is regardless if they're Jewish kids or non-Jewish kids, that the new generation growing up has to have knowledge what happened during this period of time. Because it's so important that the future will prevent from anything like it to happen again, to make sure that this never happens again, who, but not the young generation, which is growing up today, has to be knowledgeable how bad it was in the past. I survived as a small child. I went, excuse me for saying, through hell to survive. And today, when I think about it, I wonder if I would be able again to go through the same thing. So when I think about it, as I mentioned before, I think of the future generations. And I don't want them to go through what I went through. Because unfortunately, Hitler had a plan to create a society, a pure society. If he wouldn't win the war, I think he would create one. We were lucky that he didn't live through it, that he didn't win the war. But there are people who deny the Holocaust, who they hate, let's say, Jews, but there are people also that hate other people, not only Jews. So who knows? Maybe somebody gets to power who doesn't like, I don't know who, and starts doing something similar. So if people will know what it went through this period of time, maybe we will survive and will never happen what happened in the past. That's what I think.
Jennifer, Mark mentioned that he often goes into these schools and people's familiarity with the Holocaust is very limited. What is the average American public school teaching about the Holocaust? How many hours? Where is it in the curriculum? You've studied this, so where is it?
That's a great question, and thank you for what you just shared with us. It varies quite a bit. In my organization, we work with middle school, high school, and college teachers. We often work with teachers in rural places. And I would say on the optimistic side, a lot of us in New York would be really heartened to know of very dedicated, hardworking teachers across the country in places you might not expect, who give this as much time as they can and really want to learn about, keep pushing themselves forward in terms of dynamic ways to teach about it. But in terms of where it is, I think that the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum right now lists 21 states as having either mandates or requirements for teaching about the Holocaust. And my understanding is there's a great variety in what those dictate in terms of hours, grade levels, sort of requirements. So in terms of where it is on paper as far as requirements, there's a great variety, but there are many teachers who find ways to include the Holocaust sometimes beyond, a mandated requirement. So if you're an English language arts teacher, you might teach, a vetted narrative of some kind about the Holocaust that meets other requirements, even though it's about the Holocaust, right? So people find ways to bring it into curriculum that aren't necessarily, what they're being told to do. But there is a lot of work we could do still to help support teachers who I think want to teach about this subject, but find it very daunting, right? So even if you're a well-intentioned teacher, even who doesn't have a mandated requirement and you want to do this, how do you begin? right? How do you enter into this subject in the midst of everything else you're trying to do? And what is it you use to start this discussion with young people? You know that you're going to shape their world and you're going to change their vision of the universe when you start to have conversations about stories like this one, right? So helping them find ways to do that is really important.
And is your sense that the amount of pedagogy in these places about the Holocaust has increased, decreased, stayed the same over the last 10 to 20 years?
It varies widely, which is why I keep holding back from answering specifically. But I think in the last 10 to 20 years, we've seen a very large increase, happily, in the number of professional development programs available to teachers who can get themselves to those programs. And that's really important to me because there's, we know the teachers who get good professional development, who are well supported, are more likely to continue doing the work. Right? So I'm really happy to be able to share that that's increased. And these requirements are a more recent development of the last number of years, which I'm sure we'll hear more about. But so that's also a very good development. I will mention there's a historian named Peter Hayes who talked, I saw him speak once, and he talked about when he first started doing this, however many years ago, and if we said this field is about 40 years old, kind of, that in the beginning he felt like he had to start from square one with his students and that they had never really had exposure to the Holocaust and the ideas behind it. And now, and I know we're going to talk a little bit probably about surveys and what students know or don't know, but many of them have some kind of exposure, even if they haven't studied it. And he said that now he feels he often has to unteach his students things they feel like they know about the Holocaust because they've had so much exposure to it. So, it's not only how much is in the schools, it's sort of what is the situation of a student you're meeting who's already thought about these ideas or sort of thinks they know and has had popular culture encounters with the Holocaust maybe, but not actually studied it in school, versus starting with no knowledge at all. So I think our situation has changed as educators in that way.
So, Anna, I hope you'll tell us a little bit about the legislation. What does it actually mean for the teaching of the Holocaust in New York State? Just give us a granular view of it.
So I came into office and I saw that part of the New York State curriculum, every child needs to be taught about Holocaust. And it is in our law. But based on a study that I saw that was done just a few years ago, the stats were just alarming. A study of an age category of 18 to 39 showed 58% could not name one concentration camp. 28% thought Holocaust was a myth. 19% thought Jews caused Holocaust. When I looked at those numbers as a Jewish political refugee, I was just shocked. That was the stats from New York State. New York State is home to so many Holocaust survivors. And to see for us rates so low, one of the lowest in the country, really broke my heart. And we had it in our law to teach our children, the next generation, about Holocaust. But we have to recognize that we're not teaching them well. And it really became very important to me to have a legislation that will require each school district to answer to the Department of Education what it is that they're teaching and how they're teaching, so that the Department of Education, State Department of Education, could come up with a formula that could actually teach Holocaust in a meaningful way. I'm a big believer that people who don't learn from their history are people who tend to repeat that history. And right now, seeing anti-Semitism at an all-time high in 2023 in America, to see hate crimes up, it is really imperative that we each do our part. And I think education is always one of the best ways we can combat ignorance, and we can teach our children and the generations to come about the importance, a very dark part of our history, but a very important part. To see where we are heading is really alarming for someone like me, as just a citizen, as also as someone who held office. It is so important that each and every one of us to do our part to teach everyone about Holocaust. Holocaust happened to Jews, but there were millions of others who died during World War II. And we all have to understand that when we let hate grow, they come for one group first, and then they go after the second group, and then after a third group. I think education is really important, and we need to teach our children at an early age about hate. Of course, it has to be age-sensitive and appropriate, but I think when we teach our children about our diversity and about the history, they can walk away and understand that we're all children of the same God. And we can't let hate grow within us.
So I think you'll probably get unanimity from this crowd that this is a bill that needed to become a law, and congratulations, it deserves a round of applause. I suspect there's also unanimity among this crowd that Albany is not always the most functional place in the world when it comes to legislation. I'm just curious, what was the reaction of your fellow legislators? Was there opposition? How did this go down in Albany?
So legislature works on their own and comes up with legislation, and Department of Education does their own thing and comes up with their own curriculum. It was a little bit difficult to get this bill passed. And for all of you who might not know, for every bill to become law, it has to pass the Senate, and it also has to pass Assembly, both houses. And once it gets passed by both houses, then it goes to the governor for the signature and making it into a law. There were oppositions, but I also have to tell you, I had a lot of support. I went to a lot of different events when people asked me to talk about my bill and what they could do to help. And I told them that they needed to reach out to their representatives, to their senators, to their assembly members, and tell them why this was so important. And it was very timely in light of the fact that we're seeing anti-Semitism on rise. There were people who were asking me, okay, Anna, this is a big undertaking. Why don't you wash down the bill a little bit? Help us get it passed. And for me, it was really important to be true to what I believed in and the importance of the bill, and stand very strong and making sure that we pass a bill that is going to make a difference and that it's going to be beneficial for the generations to come. And I'm grateful for our Senate leader, Andrea Stewart-Cousins, and also for our governor and also the Assembly for getting this difficult bill, for us to have passed it, and for Governor Hochul making sure that she signs the bill timely, and making sure to drive that message that it's important for us to recognize when we need to take a look back at what we're not doing well and try to remedy that. I'm grateful for that, and really one of biggest joys of my political career was the day that we got the Holocaust bill signed. And as a Jewish political refugee, that was a big, big win for me.
So obviously this all starts with a level of education. Has to happen.
Yes.
I'm curious, Mark, you told your story, and your story is incredibly powerful. I really want to probe into what's effective. What parts of your story, when you're looking into the eyes of students, what parts of your story do they most engage with? And as someone with a lot of charisma, I know you know when people are engaged with your story. Where are they reacting? Where are they connecting to what you have to say?
I think they're reacting most of the time to certain incidents that I went through and how I was hiding. What made me a certain situation that I lived through it. And that's, I would say, is a lot of the questions that they ask. Or I tell them, or they ask me, and we have a conversation. Now, I mean, like, give you one example for it. That one winter that we were hiding, we were lucky that a farmer took us in. And what he did for us, to hide us, he took us to a pigsty. He dug a little hole inside. And he showed my mother, and he tells her, well, if you want to stay here, you're more than welcome to stay in this hole. But the only way you're going to survive there is not sitting or standing, but you have to lay down and lay in it. So my mom agreed, of course. So he covered this whole thing up with wood. Then he put hay on top of it. And then he brought the pigs on top of us. And that's how we live the whole winter in this, under those conditions. Well, you can imagine, we couldn't get out from there. So it was like 3 to 4 months we were living in this one hole. And you know, when nature calls you to do things, you couldn't go outside and do it. You had to do it over there. And if the pig did on top, you got some share of it inside you. So the kids, for example, are so, call it excited, but so interested to hear something like that. How could you live there? What did you eat? How was this? How was that? So you see, certain things that you went through, they kind of put this in their mind. Or if we lived and survived in a forest, certain situations, we told them. So those were the things, basically, they are what a lot of kids asking me. Yes, there are other questions too. I mean, kids ask me, for example, do you hate the Germans? And my answer to it is, you know, I don't hate all the Germans. I hate the Nazis because there were many Germans that were also killed by Hitler, and they were Germans. So we have to distinguish one from the other. In other words, the ones who are in power and doing it, or the mass population that lives in this country. Because you cannot accuse the whole country because you have a leader who is the dictator and forces on them certain things. So those are the questions that are coming up, and I try to answer them.
So it makes sense that kids would respond to an extraordinary story. We all respond to extraordinary stories, and yours is amazing. So I'm not surprised that those details come up. And I'm curious, in your experience, both in crafting legislation and studying this, what else is effective? What else do kids respond to? Is it texts? Is it survivor stories? What works to get them engaged?
I believe education, and I believe stories like Mark are very, very important and very impactful. And as we are losing our survivors, it is really imperative that we get those in tape, or we have them and we share them and make them part of the curriculum so that our children can see and hear and relate to those stories.
When you're looking at texts, not people, and curriculums, like what brings it to life for people?
And I would say survivor stories are always first and absolutely critical. I mean, you know, one of the things in the story that we just heard was that it brought up this question of choice, right? And a lot of teachers like to get their students thinking about, you know, the fact that we think of the Holocaust as this, you know, large sort of, you know, it's this enormous historical event, but, you know, just in that one story, right, there's the farmer, there's a mother, there's a child who has to endure. And so even just to begin to consider the perspective of each of those people brings us into a world of questions that each of those people then had to grapple with, right? So I would say, you know, thinking with students in regard to any text or film or, you know, various kinds of media, first of all, it has to appeal to that teacher. The teacher has to relate to it. And the students have to be asked, or the students have to be brought to engage. And I would really say that finding a way to do active, engaged learning in your classroom when you're learning about the Holocaust is the most important piece of this for me, because each student is going to respond to the story or the book they're reading in their own way, and you want to help them find what is the question that's really driving this for me. You know, what is it about your story that I'm most taken with that I want to know more about? And if you can ask them to go deeper into that and respond in some kind of active way, then you can help them move past just feeling overwhelmed with sadness or fear or despair into a kind of, okay, I can respond, I can take action, I can do something in this world that I live in right now. And I feel like that kind of teaching around, you know, whatever medium we choose to use, whatever works for us as educators, that's really going to be what makes a difference. I mean, obviously we want to think about other questions like factual accuracy and how you're representing the Holocaust when you're making your choices, but I think it's partly what we teach about it, but it's really how we teach about it and making space to do that. That's not easy to do.
Yeah, and I want to get to that because I think there are a lot of teachers who quite sincerely would say, look, I only have so many school days. There's only one history class, and there are a lot of things with a moral claim on education. Slavery, civil rights, structural gender imbalance, the slaughter of indigenous people. What is the response for why the Holocaust, when there are so many claims on the times of teachers and students, that the Holocaust not only deserves time, but deserves immersive amounts of time?
It is a very dark part of our history, and it is very difficult to speak about. But I also believe there is a story of hope there, that we could talk about not just the evil in people, but the hope in people and the good. And that when good people stand up and stand for the right thing, we all win. I do understand that there is a limited time for teachers to teach about so many different parts of our history. But I also believe this is a very important part of the history. And yes, it was targeted to 6 million Jews, but just like Mark said, so many other Germans who died. And it is not, yes, it was 6 million Jews, but it wasn't just about Jews. It is a much bigger story and much bigger history and lesson for us to teach our children and the next generation. And I think it's not just for the school, it's also upon parents to do that, to have that conversation.
Jennifer, you have thoughts on that too?
Sure. And picking up on that, I think, when we think about the Holocaust, which is a major historical event that still happened less than 100 years ago, and people are surrounding us who are still living out that legacy. So it's present and it's with us. It's one of my arguments. It's right here and it's still with us now. I also think it has a sort of unending number of moral and ethical questions within it that ask students to consider where they stand in relationship to those questions. And I think we want to believe that education asks students to think about themselves as citizens and where they are in their lives and in their country and in the world. So I think studying the Holocaust helps us do that. And I do also want to say that the Holocaust has to be studied on its own, and we want students to know it, but it certainly didn't happen in a vacuum, and it's certainly not outside of other histories of hatred and discrimination and oppression, and the list goes on, that affects other groups. So I don't think it gets taught in a way that, ideally for me, that cuts us off from all those other histories, but actually opens up for a classroom a realm of other discussion around all of those systems that we're a part of that are ongoing now and reach back into history. And so you could talk about racism and slavery and all of those things more readily with students in a classroom where you're thinking about all of those histories, I think.
So what we've been talking about to this point is education of largely of people who either don't know or know very little about the Holocaust. There is a second group out there that we should not leave out this evening, which is people who actively deny the existence of the Holocaust, right? And they actively deny the existence frequently to try and get media attention, which they can then use to create even more anti-Semitic conversation. We're going to get to the media piece of that in just one second. I'm curious, how do you engage with that group who seemingly either doesn't want to be engaged with, doesn't want to be educated, or has just been brought up in a completely different sort of environment? What can we do to get them to dismantle some of that?
The question which I have for the deniers, I think it's very simple. If you're denying that the Holocaust never happened in their mind, it's a lie. So my question to them is, don't blame, let's say, Hitler that he created that, because there was anything, right? There was nothing there. So, in other words, you blaming Auschwitz was in Poland. So you blaming the Polish people, the Polish government, that right after the war, they quick went, created concentration camps, buildings with gas chambers, with graves, with all the things that they were done in the Holocaust, in the Auschwitz, the hair, the shoes, the clothes. They created this just for what? They want to show something that happened? Or You even blame the Germans because there were concentration camps in Germany. That somehow Hitler went and he created buildings with this so they can later deny this. Don't blame anybody. Blame those countries that they created something which was never in existence. I would just like to hear their answer to it.
What about you guys? How have you engaged with it? Is it worth engaging with it?
I think it's always worth engaging. You might not always succeed, but you have to try. And I think that's why it's so important to start the education early on. Elementary school, middle school, high school, college. I think the sooner you do, I think the more you can bring people in. And I also believe media could really help out in a very big way.
So we're going to get to audience Q&A in 1 second. I just want to touch on media. We had a significant anti-Semitic incident in New York City 4 months ago. One of the most famous athletes in New York tweeted a link to a film that denies the Holocaust, an anti-Semitic film. It was a media story for several weeks, and as a person who lives inside media, I initially was very concerned because this is an opportunity to get disinformation into the bloodstream while reporting on a story. How do you guys think the news media covered that event, which was, again, right on topic and very significant in the heart of New York City?
It was really difficult to see what was happening in real time. And it is really important for all other aspects of media, whether it's the papers or social media or our TV, to make sure that they cover and they give the information and the accurate information to people. In a time that we're living with a lot of misinformation out there, it is imperative that we try to put that narrative and show the backing that this did happen. And what is being put out there is misinformation.
But I guess I'm speaking to a very specific problem, right? Which is the baiting of media with something that is wildly misinformed, covering it, and then you are putting that piece of misinformation into the bloodstream. So given media's role in educating the populace, most of our population is not in school. They are learning from media. Do you think the media did okay? What would you recommend people do better in covering those kinds of crisis moments?
You want to talk about the general populace? I go back to students because so our organization offers seminars to teachers. So when things like this are hitting, I know that thousands of my colleagues are now in crisis management in their classrooms, probably around what their students are coming in and asking them, right? So, for me, there really is, again, and those classroom conversations are going to go out into the community. They're going to go home to the parents, the students. So, it's never separate from schools for me in a way. And the kids are hearing things at home, which we, can be a mix depending on what household they're being brought up in. So, the sense of, for me, we're asking teachers to do this work. They are, in some ways, on the front lines of responding to this question for me. Right? They have young people in front of them saying, hey, and we know how fast it's traveling on the young people's phones and conversations that follow that. So what kind of facts and support do teachers need to be able to be prepared to engage in those conversations, right? Because teachers are in the middle of any media situation that happens with young people right away, so we can go back to the others. But, so in terms of what we need in education, we really want to offer them opportunities to be grounded in the facts, to be able to say right away, here's what I know happened. Here's where we can look together to counteract what's being said. Let's, as a class, go into that a little bit for a while so we can sit together with the realities of this and what's been said and what it means to still be saying things like this.
So we're going to throw it open to Q&A. I only ask that you wait for, there are two people with microphones who will come and find you. Let's start right there.
Thank you so much. I heard you mention at the beginning having to unteach students some of the things that the preconceived notions that they have in anti-Semitism. One thing that I find very striking is the use of dog whistles in the media and in the way that kids are speaking. So things that they might not realize are maliciously anti-Semitic, but they don't really understand the idea behind it. How do you think about fighting that? Because a lot of what you're talking about is basically individually fighting back against how one student or a class of students might be able to change their perception, but a lot of these dog whistles, a lot of these anti-Semitic tropes are shared at a massive scale. So from your perspective, is there any way of fighting them at as big a scale?
So if we think of classrooms as large scale, I would say, how do we help teachers be willing and able to hold a very difficult conversation that's a vulnerable space for the students, right? To say, hey, I just heard you say this thing. Do you know that there's a history behind this? Because I think you're right. A lot of times it's become so common they may not realize what they're participating in. I would advocate for classrooms where teachers can be encouraged and be willing to hold difficult conversations to allow some vulnerability in the classroom. And they have to be informed, right? The teacher has to know also what that was. So it's not easy, right, to bring that, whichever student brought it up, to let them be the one, when you bring up as a teacher that a conversation your students are having doesn't feel okay to you, your students have to be able to hear that from you, right? And there's a lot of trust in that conversation. So it's a pretty radical conversation, actually, right? I don't think just slapping them on the wrist is going to work. I mean, how do you get your students to change their thinking? And if you're studying the Holocaust and you're thinking critically about media, text, any of it, you make it a learning opportunity, right? Like, what is being said here? Why is it being said? What's driving this? Where have we heard it before? And what actual human beings are being discussed, which I think, again, the kind of humanity of the people we're talking about is always key. So that's my answer.
Thank you for all that you're doing. It's a wonderful program. I wondered what impact you thought programs such as Facing History and Ourselves are having in the classroom, and whether or not that is being used as a tool for dispute resolution. And it's something that I personally am quite familiar with, and I wondered to what extent you're aware of it.
I think this is actually what we're trying to do now, to find from each school and different regions what it is that they're teaching, how they're teaching it, find where it's working and what is working, and come up with a curriculum that could be best for the entire state. That has been the goal with my legislation, and that's what we're trying to get the information first, look at the information, analyze it, and come up with, the Department of Education will come up with a curriculum that would work best for the entire state.
Over there.
I thank all of you for your efforts in making people, young children and adults, more aware of the Holocaust. However, all of the lack of publicity about the many, many Hasidim in areas in Brooklyn and the rest of New York who are being attacked, it is not getting into the media whatsoever. We must address those issues.
Anna, do you have any thoughts just on hate crime? Something I want to make sure we get as many questions in as possible, but anything about rising hate crimes and efficacy as far as the laws go?
Again, it goes back to education. I think one of the key things that we could combat ignorance is education. And the earlier we do it, the better results we will have. No child is born with hate in their heart. We need to make sure that we teach our children early on about diversity, about different people, but people being still people, having a lot more in common than their differences. I'm a big believer that the only way we can combat all of this is through education.
Hi, do you have any suggestions for media outside of the classroom or just representation in general? I ask because I actually was sent to this talk. I work at Nickelodeon, and one of the things that we're working on as a brand is education within our shows, but not just education, just like representation in general on screen, because we were talking about stereotypes earlier, and I think a lot of times Jewish representation in the media is stereotypical, and I was just wondering if you have suggestions for resources or how to have those conversations maybe outside of the classroom in a less structured way.
I mean, one thing just as a person who has made a bunch of media, I can tell you is, between, I think the dates are 1957 and 1978, there were no Jewish characters on the 3 networks of any kind, not merely leading characters, but supporting characters. And then we went through a period where it was okay to have 1 or 2 leading Jewish men who were most likely comedians, but didn't have Jewish wives or Jewish lives. And it's a little bit better now, but ultimately, when you're making those shows, the thing that works is representation. It's just, we know this from other groups that have been underrepresented, is that you normalize people when you see them in your living room, so you have tremendous amount of power.
That's right.
And particularly as you're rising in your career, casting shows that look like the world is the answer. Okay, I think we have time for one last one there.
How did you come to decide to share your story, since it does have so much power and since it is your personal experience? How did you come to that decision to share it more publicly than just in your children and grandchildren's Hebrew classes? And have you come to recognize the power that it has in education?
Well, what sparks me, or did, to go out and bring this subject to life, let's call it, again, I will repeat myself, the hope that when I was thinking what I went through, what my sister went through, what my mom went through, trying to somehow make sure that we survive this whole thing, it came, you see, well, maybe we should share this. I should share this with others so they know, they remember. So if they know and they have friends and they have families, friends have friends, and they spread the news and they're going to tell them that this may create like a chain that people would learn and will know about it. I was hoping that this is not my dream. I was hoping that that's probably could be the reality, that this will somehow make people aware what happened at that time. And that's basically, as I mentioned even before, I didn't want it. Not only my kids, but even all the other kids went through what I went through. So I was hoping, maybe I was naive, thinking this way. But after I go and I talk to kids and I see what they do, how they react to it, then I start having a little hope, a little bit more next time, in the second time, that somehow, it works. It helps. Maybe not to the degree that I would wish to happen in such a short period of time, but it's a beginning. It is a beginning.
I think it's a perfect note to end on.
That's what I thought.
I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank you guys for being here.